Hi, I'm Tom Williams from Colorado School of Mines, and today I'll be talking about the ethical risks surrounding the use of identity characteristics in human-robot interaction. HRI researchers are increasingly attending to identity characteristics like race, gender, and culture in a variety of ways, including attempts to personalize robots' behaviors to these identity characteristics, as well as enabling robots to understand and generate descriptions of people in ways that might end up using these identity characteristics. And this worries me. Specifically, I want to ask, where does the information about these identity characteristics come from, and how is it being stored? And part of the reason why this is concerning me is because of trends we're seeing in the computer vision community, where researchers are increasingly attempting to recognize social identity characteristics like race and gender from image data. And I want to just nip this in the bud and say that our robots should not be attempting to recognize, represent, or reason over interactant race, gender, or culture. While I talk about all three of these factors in my paper, I primarily focus on race, and that's what I'm going to focus on in this presentation. I'm going to start by going back to basics and making sure we're all clear about what race is, and then talk about ontological, perceptual, and deployment concerns I see surrounding it. Race is a socially constructed structure, knowledge system, tool, or technology, depending on who you ask, for separating people into hierarchically organized categories so that value and power can be differentially ascribed to those groups. Our modern concept of race grew out of British capitalist and colonialist projects, and the first modern racial paradigm, according to historians and sociologists, was in the 17th century United States, which was developed to justify African enslavement in the British colonies. So if race is a tool, how is it used? According to Treitler, a racial paradigm in a society has the following key components: a racial architecture, which is a set of categories and a hierarchical organization over them, and a racial politiculture, which is the racial common sense that people use to sort people into categories, and the racial sanctions that are imposed when people violate those category boundaries. This structure immediately leads to what I'm calling the ontological concerns. So if robots are classifying or representing the race of an individual, this requires making a claim about racial architecture. It presupposes a set of categories that people can and should be sorted into. Let's take, for example, the Microsoft Celeb 1M dataset, in which Microsoft classified people as Caucasian, Mongoloid, and Negroid. This presupposes that people can and should be sorted into these particular categories, which is not only a wild claim to make, but also has downstream effects of reifying and reinforcing and globalizing these categories and the logic behind them. By the way, see Morgan Klaus-Scheuermann's great paper on race and gender in computer vision sets where he talks about this example. Choosing a set of racial categories is also an enormously complicated prospect because of differences between the sets of categories that are actually used by our governments to classify people versus how sociologists would view the broader sets of categories that people are using in their racial common sense to sort and categorize people. Moreover, encoding any particular categorization scheme into a robot ignores the temporal dynamics of race. These sets of racial categories used in a society change over time, and the ways that individuals or groups are assigned to those categories can change over time. As Dan McQuillan says, AI is a performance of a specific reality that marks out what must be accepted and what can be changed. And encoding a particular categorization scheme claims that that scheme must be accepted and can't be changed. Choosing and encoding a particular racial architecture also ignores the spatial dynamics of race. Different countries have different racial architectures and different racial common sense, meaning that how people are racialized changes as they move from place to place. Next, I'd like to move on to the perceptual concerns. So let's say we accepted a particular set of racial categories despite all of these concerns. This begs the question of where the labels that the robots are using to categorize individuals are coming from. In most cases, unfortunately, this is probably going to be perception. But if this is coming from robot perception, this means that the labels are being selected through algorithmic racialization. This is a form of what Simone Brown calls digital epidermalization. And this presents at least 4 key challenges. So this is imposing category without consent. It is falsely presupposing that race is something that can be objectively observed. It is reinforcing false notions of essential differences, or what Scheuermann calls auto-essentialization. And it's likely to privilege whiteness and white maleness due to poor effectiveness of face detection algorithms for people of color, especially women of color. Finally, and I'll spend the least time on this because it's the most obvious, there are clear deployment concerns. If we enable robots to perceive and classify people in terms of race, this will be used as a racialized surveillance technology by the police in their continued efforts to oppress people of color. Now, there are some reasonable counter-arguments to everything I've said so far. You could say, well, information about race could be grounded in self-identification, that is racial identity, rather than perception, that is robot racialization. I would say that Cynthia Bennett's work with blind users, for example, from marginalized communities, shows that this could be a good approach. But it also shows that at least people from those communities prefer to be labeled with less political terms. For example, using skin tone rather than race, and clothing and grooming rather than gender. A second counter-argument is that race wouldn't need to be assumed to be spatiotemporally static if you used a principled data maintenance plan, planning ahead of time how you're going to update categorization schemes and how people are assigned to them. My response here would be that this would require substantial uncompensated labor for those required to self-report their identity, and this would be exacerbated by the situated mobile nature of robots. A third counter-argument would be that the failure to recognize race would prevent robots from appropriately recognizing and responding to certain types of racist norm violations. And I would say that this is a good point, and that robots do need to be able to call out norm violations, and certain types of racist norm violations and microaggressions require knowledge of the racial identity of the parties involved. However, it's not clear that the benefits of responding to this particular narrow category of norm violation outweighs the concerns I've laid out. Finally, you could argue that failure to recognize race perpetuates a colorblind ideology. And I would say that my argument here is that robots should not recognize, represent, or reason over race, but roboticists must reject a colorblind ideology, and in fact need to do so in order to even begin to have this conversation. Finally, I will point out that none of these counter-arguments change the risks of our robots being used as racialized surveillance tools by law enforcement. So, main takeaways. The HRI community should be thinking more critically about identity characteristics like race, gender, and culture. There are critical ontological, perceptual, and deployment-oriented arguments against the representation, recognition, and reasoning by robots or by us via our robots of identity characteristics. And this doesn't mean that roboticists, however, should ignore these characteristics. And in fact, I argue quite the opposite. To conclude, I think that robots can and should be designed in positive, race-conscious ways that acknowledge the social reality of race and gender and culture, but this needs to be done in a way that does not perpetuate racist and sexist logics. Thank you.